Hi, and welcome to AXSChat. I'm delighted that we've got one of my colleagues from the Atos scientific community joining us today, David Daly. David works for Worldline and has a great deal of experience in DevOps. In fact, ran and continues to run DevOps Chat, which is a great chat on Twitter about new ways of developing software and running systems. So he's also written a white paper recently called the Digital Business Continuum, along with some colleagues. And one of the reasons why we want to talk to him is because that paper talks about inclusion and is specifically thinking about how we can be more inclusive in our ways of developing technology and adopting technology, etc. So welcome, David. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I was saying to you earlier, a little bit nervous to be the other side of the camera. I'm used to being the one that's in control. And also, I guess I should be completely upfront and say I'm completely out of my comfort zone and out of my depth here because, as you say, my background is in software, in DevOps, in Agile, where I feel I know a little bit about those topics. Whereas when it comes to inclusion, accessibility, diversity, this is where I'm really only scratching the surface. But I'm delighted to take part in that.
Yeah. We're excited about torturing you on this side of the fence. So.
That makes me feel a lot better, Deborah.
Yeah.
No, we'll be nice. I'm just kidding. We'll be nice.
So tell us a little bit about the whole digital business continuum, the thoughts behind this.
So I guess, as I said before, I used to manage a software development team. I was very interested in DevOps and Agile, but I think there's kind of two angles to this. One is that a chap who runs DevOps Guys in the UK said that he saw DevOps as the engine room for digital transformation. So that's one thing that stuck in my mind. But also more and more, I started to see that teams that wanted to become more agile and do things in a more responsive way struggled if the organization they were a part of wasn't enabling that. So started to be interested in what's the governance, what's the culture, what's the leadership styles that you need in an organization to let people be more agile and responsive to customer needs. And then that expanded a bit to us realizing that actually for long-term success, organizations need to become more adaptable and more innovative. So this idea that you kind of have a 5-year plan for your company doesn't hold water anymore, because the world is changing so quickly now that what's right today, what you think will be right in 5 years' time won't be the right thing. And if you stick to a rigid plan, then you can't take advantage of opportunities as they arise, and also you can't deal with threats and new challenges as they arise. So that's really the nutshell of how we got to starting to write the Digital Business Continuum white paper. And the question we were trying to answer is, what do you need to put in place in a company to enable people to be more adaptable and more innovative in the work that they're doing?
Okay, and if I could spin that around the other way, what do you need to take out?
What do you need to take out of
the company? So you're saying, well, what do you need to put into a company to be more adaptable and everything else? But something's got to give. So what is it that you're going to take away?
So it's a fantastic, and actually, this is a great question, and a lot of what we're talking about is actually taking things away. So I'll give you two examples. One is we looked at measures and KPIs, and the fact that a lot of organizations try to measure almost everything: utilization, cost per FTE, headcount per dollar of revenue, etc., etc. And the danger of that is the more you do that, the more people see those as the goals, rather than thinking about what's the actual purpose of the organization, what are we really trying to achieve. So one of the pieces of advice in the paper is you should choose your measures very carefully, and you should use them very sparingly. 2 or 3 should be enough. Another example, I think, would be on leadership and management, where the very short line is kind of away from command and control to success enabler. And the idea being that leaders and managers really have to move away from trying to control what people do, dictate exactly when they work and how they work, and instead help people become successful in the work they're doing for themselves. So and I think that's probably a common thread. That another one would be risk management, where we say risk management has to be seen as something that manages risk rather than avoids risk. You don't end up with checklists and 10 levels of approval for everything to try and control risk. You have to get people to be more responsible for the risk themselves. So there's a lot in there that I think would be about actually taking stuff out and making life easier for people in the organization.
Okay.
Wow, that's powerful. No, good. No, if you want to make a comment, you go first, and then I'll go.
Well, I just think that, and I'm sorry for butting in there. Essentially, there is an awful lot of stuff that large organizations create the bureaucracy around, and essentially, if we want to be fleet of foot and we want to really become more flexible and adaptive organizations, we have to shed ourselves of a lot of that stuff, but it leaves me slightly conflicted, because obviously we spend a long time trying to put in those checks and balances around accessibility in systems, where actually we need some metrics. We need, there are standards, there are things that need to be met, and the impact on people if you don't meet them is significant. So I'm not a big fan of bureaucracy, but I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is, I guess that the accessibility metrics are some of those essential ones that you need to apply lightly. Now I'll shut up and turn it over to you, Deborah.
Well, no, I'm glad you made that comment, because I was thinking, before becoming an entrepreneur, I was always in what we call corporate America, very, very large businesses. I worked for very large businesses, and we had all these things in place to try to help everybody stay in line, make sure you're following all the rules. We had them all. And I would remember sometimes there was a situation where we were going to handle a customer situation in this one specific way. And it was so illogical to me. And I went back to somebody that had been in the company a lot longer than me. And I said, why are we doing it this way? Oh, well, 15 years ago, we had one customer that had this situation, and we completely changed all of our policies to deal with this one situation that, by the way, had never come up again, and we had inconvenienced our customers for 15 years. And so I think what's so powerful about the work that you are doing, and us all trying to figure out these answers, are, how do you do it in a way that you give the creativeness to the individual, and you give the ownership and the entrepreneurial feeling, but you still protect, the company, and you consider the risks and things like that. I mean, I'm in the United States, we love to sue each other in the United States. So we're very risk averse here. But I remember whenever Yahoo had decided they weren't going to let people telework anymore, and there was all of these things that hadn't been considered, including employees with disabilities or employees that had children with disabilities. There are so many moving parts. So how do we do this in a way, using the example that Neil was given with accessibility? How do we help the developers, for example, want to build the accessibility in, because it's going to make their product better? I remember on my program, Human Potential at Work, I interviewed August de la Reyes, and I probably said his last name wrong, but he is the chief designer, one of the chief designers at Pinterest. And he said, I believe that developers actually have to go out of their way to assure that it's not accessible. Instead, so he's looking at it sort of different, because the reality, and before we started the show, we talked a little bit about your mother. You said, David, your mother's 75 years old. And can you repeat that story? Because, and Neil was complaining because he goes to turn on this, the Google chat, and they've changed the interface. And so generally if we were super logical and organized, we would go on to the interface 2 hours before, make sure nothing has changed. But that's not the way it works. So do you want to expand a little bit on that? How do we, you know?
Yeah, and I think so. So yeah, the story of my mum is she's 75. She's, I think, doing pretty well for a typical 75-year-old. Uses email, uses the internet, uses WhatsApp. But when a download of a new version of Firefox or whatever kind of comes automatically, and buttons and menu items have moved, and the way of doing things is suddenly different, she doesn't think, well, hey, great, a new version of Firefox. She just thinks,
a treasure hunt.
How do I search now is the question she has. So yeah, I think that affects all of us. But it's a very, just coming back to your point, Neil, I think it is an area where I'm not certain. I have come to the conclusion that sometimes you need metrics and KPIs that are more for a diagnostic temporary purpose. And when I say temporary, that could still be quite a long period of time. But if you have a specific challenge, then you may need a KPI to help you see, are we improving in that area? But ideally, once you've improved, you should no longer need the KPI.
Sure.
Is one thought I have on that. But I also think, not specifically in kind of accessibility or inclusion, but I think so often we have a KPI, we measure it, and then people. So let's say we said to developers, well, your KPI is that you have a review for accessibility with a peer before you release software. There is a danger that they will just say, someone will say, David, can you review my thing for accessibility? I'll say, yes, looks okay, job done. They've ticked the box and the KPI is okay, but have they really understood what they need to do? And it takes me back to a conversation, there's so many links here, with Larry Mascheroni, who was looking at how do you get people thinking about security. And his whole point was, you can't have security in software as a gatekeeper. It has to be an activity that's performed day in, day out by the people on the team. So I'm very hesitant to say we shouldn't have KPIs, because I think sometimes you need them to get a change in behavior. But I would say still the end goal should be that people do that as a matter of course because they understand the importance and the benefit, rather than that they think they have a rule to follow or a box to tick.
Yeah. Good point.
So I agree with you. I think it needs to be a hearts and minds thing. It's how do we embed that into the education of people? Obviously, DevOps is a very fast-moving thing. Essentially, I've got some sympathy with it, because actually, as a small accessibility team, you get involved with the developers, you get involved with the end users, you get involved with the supporting stuff. So in some ways, DevOps was familiar before it even happened, because we've always been doing the dev and the ops, and you sit there and you go, please don't do that, because I'm going to have to support that afterwards, and see those kind of things before they happen. But it's really getting that into the minds of the teams that are now delivering this, and I guess actually it's the ops to dev feedback loop that really needs to happen, where they're working with user groups with a diverse range of users, so that they can get that feedback. And going back to the story with your mum, DevOps is great in some ways because it's driving improvements and it's driving adoption of technologies really fast. But equally, that acceleration of technologies and that loss of control, because that was what you just talked about with your mum, is that what's happening now is we're signing up to, we no longer get something on a disk or on a USB drive that you install and it's kind of static. You get some updates, but it's kind of static, and you could live with that for years. You're in control of whether or not that changes. That's not the case anymore with software as a service, and essentially pretty much everything is as a service now. And that means that yes, you can leave the house it's a bit like leaving the house in the morning and coming back and finding someone's rearranged all the furniture, and now the bed's by the front door. So that is a challenge for a number of people. It's not just people with disabilities, but for older users, for people with cognitive disabilities, it's particularly tough. And I think that what we need to be looking at is also is to help software adoption rates as well, because one of the things that we see failing a lot is people bring out new products, or businesses introduce new ways of working. And say, this is it. This is the fabulous new way of working. You're going to love it. It's better than anything else. This is it. Forget your old ways of working. This is the new shiny. But we don't actually take any care in how do we transition users? How do we not only convince them that it's better, but actually guide them to what's through the change process? So is that something that you see as, where does that responsibility lie within the DevOps team? Because to me, that feels like a missing piece.
I think it often is missed. It reminds me of, there's a very specific practice called release versus deploy, which is this idea that you may well, it's kind of where you have feature toggles. So the idea is you might make lots of changes to the software behind the scenes and be releasing that very frequently and maybe testing it with a sample set of users, but you don't actually have to deploy it to everyone. You don't have to deploy a new visible change to every user every week or every day. But I think, again, I wrestle a little bit with this, because I think that in general, and I could be shot down here, if I think of software back when I was at university 20 years ago, it was generally much harder to use, I think, than software is today. But I wrestle with that because maybe it wasn't. So again, feed back to me. Do you think, is it usability and improving, or?
I think it is. I think it definitely is. I mean, I know there's still a lot to work and a lot to do, and I think that often accessibility is forgotten. So it's more usable for some users than others.
Yeah.
But I perceive that it's definitely improved. My mother, she recently passed, but she hated technology and was really afraid of technology. And I remember she went and she bought an iPhone, and she also had a little track phone, and she would say, "Deborah, how do I use this phone?" And so I wrote out the directions, I put pictures, but my mother could not, and I'm not exactly sure why, maybe because of her diabetes, she could not swipe the phone on. She couldn't swipe it on. And I would swipe and I would say, "Mama, you put it," and I everything I could, and she never could master swiping on the phone. So just little things like that, I think, well, is that, like you, I get confused about it.
And I think, coming back to your hearts and minds statement, I mean, I think that's where AXSChat is absolutely fantastic. And I'd encourage anyone, but I'd encourage developers to attend at least a few sessions, because I remember a very specific case where we were talking about software, and I said, well, what I could do with is someone to have a look at the DevOps Chat website and tell me if it's accessible. And someone on AXSChat volunteered to do that and said, actually, it's pretty good because you've used WordPress and that's quite good out of the box, but you need to make sure you put your alt tags in for your images. And of course, ever since then, I've made sure there is a descriptive alt tag for every image. And I didn't before. So, I don't know if that's a good or a bad. I think the change is good. And I think
it's a good thing too.
And I think similarly, Neil once pointed out to me that screen readers, you can step through the links on a page. So having the link, so I often write on a page something like, you can check out our white paper here. And what I used to do was just put the link on here, which I guess meant that if you're using a screen reader, you would just see a link to here. Well, that's not very useful. Expanding the link out to say you could, to cover the whole, you can download our white paper here, means that it becomes more accessible. So I think there are things, those are things that once you've seen that it matters to people, then you just do it. You don't necessarily need a check. So I think it is that's why I very much believe it can't just be a checkbox. People have to understand why it's important.
I think that's really absolutely fundamental, that people need to understand what the impact is on users, and often I don't think that there is any malign intent, apart from obviously in terms of marketing. Then there is, because actually people design stuff deliberately to confuse you. So if you think of AVG antivirus would be a great example of dark marketing patterns, where essentially you can't see the thing that allows you to get the stuff for free. It's always wanting to sign you up. The thing that looks the most obvious button to press is the one that says, please sign me up for the 3-month trial that will then hook me into the paid service. So those kind of things are bad. The antivirus software is pretty good, but the design pattern is bad, and it's bad for older people. It's bad for cognitive disabilities, it's particularly people with learning difficulties who are likely to fall foul of this. I also think that so I'm going to be a little bit more miserable than Deborah, in that I think that there was a long period of time where the user interface and technology got easier to use, and then what's happened is that whilst you've got a load of stuff that is the technologies are making your life easier, the way we interact with it is getting harder.
I agree.
So what you've got is you used to have visual cues. So this is not about accessibility. The underlying accessibility of a lot of products has got a lot better. It's built into iOS, it's built into your Android phone, and a lot of the apps support the accessibility features. But at the same time, basic how do you use stuff is harder, especially if you don't have visual cues for some of the stuff. So putting everything off screen, relying on gestures, can be really hard. The design trend for flat design means that you don't know what's a button or what's just decorative. Those kind of things are problematic. And yes, the lack of color contrast is probably the biggest thing that has made stuff hard for people in the last few years. The trend for grey on light grey has actually been made life difficult for so many people. So there's more than just development. It's this whole sort of choice of and thinking about stuff. And actually, if you're having to squint at this and you're 25, what's it going to be like 20 years down the line? My sight's not quite as good as it was, right? At some point I'll end up with glasses, and but already what I have noticed is that in low light levels the color contrast really makes a huge difference. So from my point of view, you want people to be successful. You want people to use your product. So surely design and how you implement stuff is crucial to enabling that success. So what you want to do is design something that people are going to be successful in using your product, so that they get the right end result. And for me, that's a crucial tenet of accessibility and usability, and it should be something that is desirable to the developer community as well, because it's not, oh look, I've implemented this great new feature, oh look what I can do with the REST API. It should be, well, what's the outcome? So
it's interesting you mention that, because I remember about 5 years into my career getting the Microsoft visual design guidebook or something like that, and it was quite a thick book, but it literally said, and because it was at a time where Windows was more or less the only game in town really for home PC users, I'd say, a lot of corporate users, and it literally kind of said the file menu will always be the first menu, the help menu will always be the last menu item. It was very prescriptive, and like you said, buttons will always have a 3-dimensional border, labels that you can't edit won't have any kind of border, text boxes. All of this was kind of laid out by Microsoft in very almost excruciating detail, but it did mean that applications were generally discoverable because everything had a menu, even if you could do it some other way. And also there was a high degree of consistency between how you did things in different applications. And I think as we've seen web interfaces develop with various different frameworks for developing them, different mobile platforms, and even now Windows interfaces generally looking a lot less consistent between applications, I think we have, I'd almost say it looks sexier in some ways, but I'm not, I mean, sometimes I discover things on my iPhone literally by accident. I'm like, oh wow, if you swipe a bit further, it does that. I had no idea. So I think that definitely resonates with me. But so now I'm going to tell another story about me not being particularly good, which I seem to have far many of them. When I managed a software development team, there was someone on my team who was partially sighted. And I would like to think that, so the positive side is I kind of said, what do you need? And we'll get it. So I don't think I was the worst manager in the world. But when I look back, I never really saw that it wasn't just a kind of a difficulty to work around and support. We should have had him feeding back on the usability of our software, helping us understand how we could make it better and made it a positive asset. So as I say, I think, I'm not saying I was a terrible boss, but looking back, I should have done better because, and I think as well, but I'd have to check, some of the support that could be in place was a bit embarrassing. He didn't necessarily want that because it drew attention to him. And again, I think, so I think I was far away from celebrating it as an asset. You know, I was maybe accommodating it, but I wasn't celebrating it. And I think, again, then when we look at all of this, you know, yes, as you say, a developer with a massive screen with great eyesight who's just joined the company might think their grey on white with a bit of dark grey looks really good, but you need the people on the team who go, well, yeah, okay, might look nice to you, but I can't use that.
Yeah, and mea culpa, I'm guilty. Back in a previous life, I had a record label, and I look back at the first 12-inch that I put out, and it was embossed grey on grey. I was like, I can't read this now. I know what it says because I released it, but I'm struggling. So you know, it's the folly of youth. But
well,
actually,
and we just don't know. Sometimes you don't know what you don't know. I remember the first website I designed. I thought it was really cool and really, and then I had a gentleman at the Science Foundation say, well, it's totally inaccessible to me, Deborah. The only thing I can get when I go online to look at your website is the name of your company. That's it. I'm like, what? So, I mean, sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, which is why I think these conversations and the DevOps stuff that you've been doing in the white papers, that's why it's so critical, because I programmed for years and I never said, well, I wonder how many people I can leave out of my program that won't be able to use it. I mean, I never did that as a programmer. And so it's just, that's why these conversations are so powerful, because, and it's something that you said earlier, David, and we talk a lot about in AXSChat. It's like, if I understand why, then I'm going to be so much more empathetic about it. It's like, oh, no, you don't ever want to do that because it's going to cause this. Oh, okay. So I think most programmers and most people that are designing software stuff, we want you to use our programs. Yeah. So
I think it's, you know, the whole rulebook thing. Well, I probably wouldn't read the rule book, but and the consistency that it brought was desirable, and one of the reasons why I find it desirable, because it's actually, I need discoverability because I can't remember the interfaces. That's one of the issues that I have with my dyslexia, is that I'm rubbish at remembering the interfaces. So discovery is important. So having something that's hard to do that discovery on, or is inconsistent, is taxing. So it's more tiring to use technology now than it was when, even though it looks a lot nicer, it is pretty, it's just pretty hard. So I think that's one thing, but I think that you're right. You don't give people the rule book because they're not going to read it. You need to get them in touch with people. Now, one of the joys of the last few years has been social media. It's been social video. There's loads of stuff out there. So and of course there's a great community around AXSChat where we're happy to have people come and talk, and we can stand up people that can come and talk to the development teams. We can put stuff out there for people to test and play with and poke about at, and really it's wanting to sort of foment that crossover between our community, which is a community of users and technologists wanting to do stuff that's inclusive, and the general development community, which I don't think happens often enough, and I'm hoping that we can encourage some of your community to cross over and join with us, so they get that empathy and that understanding about why it's important to do or not do stuff that can be facilitating for everyone, and hopefully means that in the broadest sense of things, if it's a website that's a transactional site, that they get more sales. The simple fact is, if people can complete the task, it relates to money, or one way or another. Either you're making more money because you're selling more stuff, or you're not losing as much money because you're having to support people where they're failing. So there's an economic benefit to it too.
And also, we have a regular user, and we featured him one time on AXSChat too, Chris Ilona, who is a developer in the United States. And it's always interesting because he hates the standards. He hates all the W3C. And I can say this on this video. I know he'll watch it because he does. He hates all of that stuff. He understands the reason why we've got to have them. But he wants to be more innovative with the way he's building websites. And he is very innovative what he's doing. But what's interesting with the sites he builds here in the US, that our laws say you will do X, Y, Z, right? So it almost, some of these laws and legislation sort of stamps out the ability to be creative. And I know that frustrates him, but I think that's why it's so important in the white paper that y'all have written. And I want to make sure that, is this something that the AXSChat community can read? I mean, is it available?
Oh yeah. It's available on Atos' website. You'll see a few links to it in David's Twitter feed, I'm sure.
Yes, good. Every day.
Right. Yes. And let's make sure we put it out on AXSChat.com so people can actually read it. I think it takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing, because when we're innovating and we're saying, well, what if we did it this way? Less key performance indicators, KPIs, but you really have a lot of people that are going to come back and go, no, we've always done it this way. So you can have some backlash.
So I suppose what I'd like to do is just very briefly tell the story of how the diversity, which is only a very small part of the paper, but how that part ended up being in there, because we didn't set out to include it is the first thing. So we never had a kind of structure or an outline that had that in it. But also it wasn't added as a kind of afterthought, in that someone didn't say, oh, you've got to have something on diversity in there, so you better add it. What actually happened was we were looking at why do companies fail? And one of my colleagues was saying, well, it's simple. They just keep spending money on the wrong things. They need to make sure they invest in the right things, not the wrong things. And I kind of thought, well, yes, that's true, but it's a little bit obvious. And why do generally intelligent, clever people carry on investing in the wrong things in their organization and not spotting new trends or new opportunities? And we led to this kind of, well, it's because people surround themselves with other people who are all the same, and they all think, well, we're the best engineers and we've got the best products, and so why should we change? Until suddenly the wind changes and we're not, we're out of business. So, and that's where we realized, okay, well, that's where diversity becomes essential. So you have to look at, because that's what gives you the fresh thinking. And the strange thing is, it is uncomfortable. No one actually likes it when someone new joins and says, well, why are you doing it that way? Well, this would never work for my friends. No one likes that. But actually, if you want to survive in the long term, we kind of recognise that that's absolutely essential. So that's what I'm saying, is that's how it ended up in the paper, was not as an afterthought because we thought it was an important topic but we hadn't put it in, but also we didn't, it was literally a discovery. It's not, I'm sure it's not a unique discovery, but it was through our conversations as we were writing it that we came to that realisation. But having said that, it is small, and I would absolutely welcome feedback from people, from anyone really, on any part of the paper relating to that, because I think, if I'm honest, we're on version 1. You know, I can't pretend that we've written something and that's going to be the end of it and that it's going to be perfect. So I do welcome anyone to read it and to feedback to me in any way, so that we can look at what else we perhaps need to include or cover.
Yeah, I think that you know, we know for sure that there is tension in diversity, but that tension creates open questioning is the antidote to groupthink, and hopefully is the thing that protects companies from, you know, going from hero to zero. Talking of heroes, we want to thank Barclays accessibility team for, you know, being our supporters and continuing to support us along our journey. It's a great pleasure to work with them, and a great honor to have them supporting us. We also want to thank you very much, David, for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us on Twitter. Absolute pleasure. As always, with any involvement I have with AXSChat, I learn so much from it. So it's been a real pleasure to discuss. We do too. And every time, David. I can't wait for this chat. Really looking forward to it. Fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, David. Thanks, Barclays. Bye, everyone.